Hello, I wanted to review with you Chapter 3 of Writing Your Dissertation or Capstone. This is the Nurse's Step-by-Step Guide by Karen Rausch. So again, this is coming from Chapter 3, and a few elements come from other texts that I've used in the past in explaining methodology to other students that hopefully having a variety of perspectives will help your understanding of the content. So the first component that we're going to talk about is the design of your study. So there are basically three approaches to a study, which is qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. And I think at this point you are familiar with all three of these. The qualitative is doesn't really use instrumentation like the quantitative does. It's more of a open communication between the researcher and the subjects. They're looking more for themes on a particular topic, where quantitative uses instruments that have specific questions, and the instruments will have certain context or components within the instrument that the researcher is looking for specific data. And then mixed methods is a combination between the qualitative and the quantitative. So you will have a quantitative component that looks for specific information that participants will answer on a survey or a questionnaire, but then the researcher will use that data from the quantitative study and develop a qualitative component to really look at why the individuals or the participants answered the way that they did. They'll get a little bit more of a background, if you will, pertaining to that specific population. So let's look at designs then. So with the quantitative studies, there are several designs: experimental, quasi-experimental, single subject, non-experimental, which is your descriptive, associational, and comparative studies. So if you are doing an experimental study where you're looking at two completely separate groups, you're doing an intervention on one group and not on the other, you're going to obviously mention that you're doing an experimental study. A single subject, many people do not use a single subject. This is lumped in actually with quasi-experimental, but the chapter that I received, or that I looked at out of a textbook called Research Methods in Applied Settings, they did actually have a separate section for single subject. But if you're not doing a single subject research, this would not pertain to you. And then, of course, most students will do a non-experimental. They're looking at descriptive statistics, where it's like more frequencies, and then associational and comparative will do more inferential statistics. So we'll get into that in just a moment. And then qualitative designs. This again is the research method where you don't necessarily have a questionnaire or surveys. You're going to ask your participants questions, and these are, again, questions that are not yes-no questions. They require each participant to really elaborate on their answers, and then you go and you look for common themes. So you could have phenomenological, grounded theory, ethnographic, case study, and narrative qualitative designs. So when you are reporting on the design of your study, you're going to choose one of these and then just elaborate a little bit on how your study, for example, is a quasi-experimental study. What are your variables, your independent and your dependent variables, for example? So the setting, you're going to describe the facility or the organization. This includes administration, management, nursing leadership structures, financial data, staffing patterns, and patient population. You will also want to include aspects that could impact the outcomes of your project. For example, we know that many changes occur within facilities that are sweeping changes, and one of those is maybe a change from the electronic medical record software So if they go from, example, would be going from MedHost to Epic. This is a pretty big change that's occurring within the institution. So if your study participants, for example, are nurses and you are collecting data during this big change, this could significantly impact the outcomes of your project, or actually the outcomes of your survey, because you may not have as many participants because this might be a high stressful time. Outcomes, again, if you are looking at data that's already been collected and is stored at your facility and it's saved in one method, but then the program has changed, the software program has changed and that data is no longer available, or they're transcribing it into a new software package, then it might be difficult for you to obtain that data. And then, of course, it's always a good idea, identify your stakeholders in your project and any resources that might be needed, like extra personnel, if you require a certain begin and end point, and you need to let the stakeholders aware that you're doing this. So basically, resources can be anything. It can be personnel, it can be costs, it can be certain tools that you need, that sort of thing. So your sample population, this is the who are the people who you want to survey? What population are you wanting to learn more about? And how is this the population that's going to be impacted by your project? So obviously, your project is going to stem around a specific population of people, and this is going to be your sample base. So for instance, if you're going to make a program to implement improved or increased referrals for patients who have congestive heart failure, your population might be actually the physicians or the providers who make those referrals. So that's just one example. So you also want to include the number of participants that you need for a strong sample size. Your book uses the example of G-Power. I have found the RheoSoft calculator to be very easy. It's very straightforward. You just plug in a few numbers and you have your sample size. Then how will you obtain your participants? Are you going to send out memos? Are you going to talk with them personally? So you'll want to include how you're going to obtain your participants, and then include any exclusion or inclusion criteria. So obviously, for example, if you're going to survey nurses, are you going to survey a specific unit of nurses? So if you're going to, if you want to learn more about ICU practices, then your inclusion criteria is going to be that they need to be ICU nurses. Age is also another one. Very generally speaking, anyone over the age of 18. So you can include that. So it's basically the exclusion-inclusion criteria is very specific to your study population. So you'll definitely want to include both of those criteria. And then with ethical approvals, so the first one being the IRB approval from the facility and then the academic institution. So at McKendree University, we require that everyone have their IRB approval from their facility first, and then apply for IRB through McKendree University. An important component of this is the informed consent. So you want to be very, very thorough when you write up your informed consent, how you are going to get informed consent by your participants. If you're using something like a SurveyMonkey, where it's going to be a survey distributed online, you can simply say in your disclosure that by completing this survey, you have consented to be a participant in the study. But just make sure that you include in there any of the benefits and any of the risks associated with participating in the study within your informed consent document. And then data collection with quantitative, typically it's with questionnaires or surveys. You can do observations, and then biophysiological. This is really looking at lab values and that sort of thing, which may or may not be applicable to your studies. Qualitative, really focus on interviews and focus groups. And then, of course, you'll have a demographic component. Most of you will have a demographic component to your data. And then how you're going to store the data. So make sure that you look specifically at what the IRBs require. Some institutions require 5 years, some it's 3, some it's 7 years, that it's going to be in a locked or password protected kind of entity. So make sure you include how you're going to be storing your data, and that you as the researcher will be the only one who will have access to that data. Instruments. If you're doing a quantitative study, you'll want to make sure that you're finding an instrument that's already been used, has well-documented validity and reliability. If not, and you have to modify an instrument, you may want to do some pilot testing for that. If you're developing your brand new instrument, of course, you're going to need to pilot test that as well. So my recommendation is finding an already existing instrument, and hopefully it is applicable to your to what you want to do with your research. Data analysis. How will you analyze your data? So with qualitative analysis, it's usually through coding or finding those common themes. With quantitative analysis, it's descriptive. You could do describing your data, frequencies, where you just calculate out the frequency or the percentages. For more detailed quantitative studies, you may be required to do inferential statistics, and that's if you're looking for associations or correlations. And that requires usually SPSS or SAS software. So with rigor, with qualitative, these are the attributes that you really want to reflect on and include in your write-up. And then with quantitative, you want to be able to prove that the reliability, validity, and the generalizability of your study. So you will write about how each of those components are met. And then the fun begins. So once you have IRB approval, then you can begin collecting your data and then analyzing that data. And this is where where everything starts to come together, where you can really look in and see the importance of why you need to implement this project. So I hope that you found this informational, and please do not hesitate to contact me for any questions. Thank you.